Very welcome back. Now we have done our trip around the world. We're back to Stockholm here again, and we have, surrounding up this afternoon, a panel again to have a discussion on important topics on how we develop sort of the regions to become more innovative. And you all met Mary so far. We have two new guests here, two new speakers. Maria Rankka, who's the CEO of Stockholm Chamber of Commerce, and Camilla Mellander, who's head of unit at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So very welcome to you as well. So let's not spend more time on that, rather get into the topics. And I would like to, one of the things that were discussed earlier, we had 3 different presentations about Berlin, Singapore, and San Diego, and earlier today, a lot of information regarding Stockholm. So I want to more have a sort of general question about sort of how can regions learn from each other and work together? Because Steve and I talked a little bit during the break that, to some extent, it's all about a co-opetition. We should collaborate, but it's also competing in some sense. How do you find the right balance there? And what are the strengths and weaknesses we should work with, and how can different regions work together to sort of make the world a better place overall in these turbulent times? So I don't want who wants to be the first out and deep dive into the water. Who's the daring one?
Okay, I'm the daring one. So I really appreciated the presentations in our group this morning, earlier, because I think there are very distinct regional differences, right? We all have different histories, industrial legacies, we have different cultures, we have, in other words, so we need to respect regional, the specificity of regions. What I can say, coming from a region that isn't great at scaling companies, and probably never will be, Berlin will be. You're a great historic city. Singapore, Stockholm, my city is not going to scale companies. But we're going to create incredible technologies that may be of value to companies that are scaling, or components or pieces of what other companies are developing. So if we see these regional startup innovation clusters, if you will, as opportunities to create value that can connect to what other regions are trying to do, or to scale a local technology into an international marketplace, that's where I think the opportunities are, because I think there are very few places that can do everything well. We're each going to be good at certain things, and by understanding, I would much rather spend a week in Berlin than San Diego. I'm not a surfer. It's a great city. It is a great city with a great history. And Singapore is a gateway to Asia. But we have a lot to offer you as well in terms of the crazy startup culture that's there. So that's what I think is the promise here. That's why I don't see it as competitive, but as potentially iterative, if that's a better word.
So do you see, in a sense, one could talk about, we're talking about global value change when it comes to companies. Mm-hmm. Could we think about global value change when it comes to regions?
I think there's an innovation value chain we need to be talking about. Yeah.
Maria's.
There is, of course, if you look at successful global cities generally, they all have a great talent pool. They all have companies and academic institutions in the technological forefront, and they are, and I think it's really important these days to stress this, they are open to trade. So technology, talent, and trade are important components. And then to the, is it collaboration or competition between cities? It's probably both. And in addition, Mary added a very important word that also starts on the C. Connectivity. So it's about competition, collaboration, and connectivity. And then to be much more concrete, because I think probably all of us, we agree that these are important factors. What do you need in order to sort of excel in this? You need some kind of infrastructure for connectivity and collaboration between cities. And air transport. I'm looking at at Chris Heister, the governor of Stockholm. She works hardly for improving air connectivity to Stockholm.
Yeah.
That is one factor. It's a very hard factor and it's very concrete, but it also matters. And there are many more, but I will come back to them later.
Well, talking about global value chains, I was just given the figures of how many parts there is in a Volvo XC90. 10,000 parts. And these parts come from 90 different countries. So it just shows how interconnected we are. And I think that Stockholm, as a very innovative startup hub, has all the right conditions to have them meet with the innovative people in Berlin. I mean, we already see a number of our people from the high-tech sector going to Berlin, and Singapore. I mean, this is the gateway of Asia, and I can say that because I spent 4 years in Hanoi looking enviously at what Singapore had to offer, and also, I mean, most of our life science companies find their way to the United States. So, I mean, if you have the right conditions, as Maria was saying, with the funding from the government, with the academia, with the entrepreneurs, it will continue to be very, very successful. And I think that's what we're seeing. Another thing which I think, and it's not really related to innovation, but it's how do we keep our societies sustainable? Because it's not only about innovation, it's also about keeping our societies sustainable. And I think we all represent cities that are very sustainable. And I think that to think in that long perspective, I mean, looking back, Stockholm had its first environmental plan in 1976, 40 years back. This is what gives quality of life in our cities. And this is what makes people want to stay in our cities. And nothing can make me happier than seeing people swimming right in the middle of Stockholm. Yeah. You can even drink the water from Riddarfjärden. Yeah. And when, having lived in Asia for a number of years, the fact that you can breathe the air without a lot of pollution and drink the water out of the tap. These are the things that we need to preserve to keep our cities competitive and attractive.
Do you want to add something, Thomas? You're on.
I think, yes, I totally agree, in particular to what you said about the sustainability, sustainable city, sustainable region, which should cooperate together in order to keep this situation on. To give others the opportunity to learn from them. So I think we have a number of global challenges in the world that we cannot cope purely on a regional basis. So a lot of regions can contribute, a lot of companies can contribute that are regionally bound. So this is the first point where I would say it is definitely necessary that we cooperate. Not just companies should cooperate on this level, but also the region should cooperate. And I think we have to distinguish a little bit between cooperation on the instrument side, on the methodologies, on how to bring together these ecosystems of companies and institutes to make them able to work together, to make projects together and to come up with products finally. And on the other side, on the technical issues. And on the technical issues, I think it is important to define the right areas where the most strongest regions find ways to cooperate together. For example, in the ICT sector, in sectors of life science, but even in the startup sector, which is of course broad from the technical point of view, but I think this is very attractive for the startup hubs to work together because there's not so much history involved in there. They all make their first experiences in these ecosystems, and then active interchange between these regions would be very valuable for all. We make in Berlin our first experiences with corporations with the US, with New York for the moment, and in Asia with Shanghai and with Tel Aviv in Israel. And we we clearly experience that it is very valuable, not just for the region, but for the involved startup companies to go, for example, 2 weeks to an ecosystem in Israel, and somebody from the US is coming to learn more about the conditions in Shanghai for 3 weeks. This is very much driving our activities towards the future.
Do you see any? Should be on. I think that's a good example. How, very concretely, because so it's easy we talk about on the 30,000 feet level, 10,000, instead of concrete activities on the ground. I was thinking from the different presentations here today, particularly this afternoon. So, if you think about both on very concretely what we can learn from each other, what are sort of the things? If you would think about, Mary, what do you think San Diego could learn from? The other two places, and also Stockholm, the other way around. Spend the time on that.
Yeah, one of the things that I've learned from Stockholm, and it actually was when Ericsson became part of Qualcomm for a brief time, and I knew a lot of the Swedes, and the business culture was so different, and the attitude among Europeans that we need to move around the world. We need to, your point, we need to spend time in other people's places. And Americans are not like that, and it's going to hurt us. And even in the most innovative environments, there's a sense, they'll come to us. But I think your idea, so I'm always encouraging students, but also entrepreneurs, spend some time in Europe, or go to Shanghai, or go to Rio de Janeiro. I don't know. But this notion of getting inside the skin of another culture, as well as collaborating, you see, with the innovation. So I love this idea of programs that would foster exchanges for entrepreneurs or small companies to have an experience in another environment where they might find a partner, or they might just learn how to develop their technology better for that market eventually.
Yeah, a lot of people ask me, what is the benchmark for Stockholm? And the answer is, of course, there are many. So it depends on the question. And we can learn from Singapore in terms of bold ambitions and speed. We can learn from Berlin in terms of a more well-functioning housing market. We can definitely learn from California and San Diego, which is one of my favorite places in the world in terms of entrepreneurial spirit. And
spirit.
Of course, maybe that point would have been better to make last week, but also in terms of sunny weather. But so we can learn from a lot of places. That being said, I think there is a lot of untapped potential for more internationalization, broadly speaking, even in a place like Stockholm or Sweden. Our self-perception is that we are more international than we are. And one argument that very often is being made is that 50% of GDP is export, and we have all those big multinational companies, and we should be extremely proud of them, of course. But that being said, if you look at the Swedish economy, most companies, most businesses that are in internationally traded industries are not globally active. So there are untapped potential. And we know that, if businesses become more international, that will increase productivity, that will ultimately also have an effect on innovation. That is today's theme. So I think that is hugely important. So I think we have to be, both proud of our history, but also sort of self-critical in a constructive way to actually try to find out, what are the best peer cities, given sort of what we want to benchmark? What are the concrete collaborations, sending tech delegations to interesting startup environments in San Diego or Tel Aviv or Berlin or other places, and so on and so forth. So I think we have a lot of work to do, and there are huge reforms that need to be done or carried out. But also, I think my organization have argued for Stockholm to appoint a foreign and trade minister, which is not, of course, will not change the world, but it's a sort of symbolic measurement that will sort of start telling the story of where we, at least according to me, should be headed.
Well, I will take that suggestion back to the ministry. And as you were saying, Maria, I mean, there's a lot of potential. I just heard the figure of how many percent of our companies that are exporting, 11%. So it means there's a great potential. Man. We already export a lot to Germany and a lot to the United States, but where we would like our companies to go is to Asia, because this is where the growth is. Mm-hmm. This is where 50% of the world's growth will be in 2020. So we launched an export strategy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs 1.5 years ago, and we would like to help the small and medium-sized companies as well as the big companies to find a way to Asia. Because this is also, I mean, from technological and research point of view, a region that we really need to know much better. And I think all of us are thinking, oh yes, they will come to us. They will come to Stockholm. They will come to San Diego. They will come to Berlin. No. As the Chinese are saying, you should learn Chinese. Why should we learn English? Mm-hmm. The world is changing and very fast.
Yeah. Partly for that reason, my two younger kids, my son is 23, lives in the UK doing his PhD, speaks, reads and writes Mandarin, and my youngest daughter is still at home, and she speaks, reads and writes Mandarin, because I think China is going to be the economic force in the decades ahead. I had this big debate with my former CEO when I was in corporate world, in 2005, when I said we need to really speed up because China is doing a lot more innovation. This misunderstanding that China is copying as opposed to innovating. But here we are now in 2017. So my view, and Mary may or may not agree, that's the great thing about discussions on a panel, is I think China is going to lead the world in medical technology in the decade ahead, because China has a perfect storm of hunger, which I mean in a positive sense, ambition, essentially unlimited resource, and a commitment to trying to be a leader, which means obstacles are resolved at a fast pace. So as much as I think there's amazing infrastructure in places like San Diego, I think that some of the mechanics of doing things won't necessarily keep pace with what I think is going to be happening.
And particularly
in China.
the scale. It's just amazing.
You've got millions and millions of people that are able to do, and I mean that in a literal sense, millions, that are able to do research and experimentation because there are billion, 4 billion, 5. So you've got massive capability, and money is not the issue. Yeah. And there is a commitment to trying to be there. So for me, gene editing, things that are going to be the future of precision medicine, how drugs are mixed and remixed, I think is going to be substantially China. So anybody that's not going there to the point, which is if everybody's waiting for somebody to come in and introduce themselves, which they will, by the way, because China is also on an expansionist strategy. China is investing everywhere around the world, and China will be an owner of or an investor in any company. The U.S. just, today there was a thing in the press saying that the U.S. government is becoming anxious about how much ownership of startups China is able to currently secure in places like North America, because they're now concerned that machine learning and computer vision and some of these things that are going to be important are either owned by or invested in. And I'm not saying that from a protectionist. I'm just saying the reality is China will own a lot of the technology. Some of the most important AI work is occurring in China. So for me, it's a matter of trying to partner with and work with. There's no way to compete with, right? And I'm not a defeatist, but there is no way to compete with China. So our strategy is 100% partner with, collaborate with, make all the great friends. The good news is Singapore has a little head start because Lee Kuan Yew and Deng Xiaoping were friends, and so China still looks favorably on us in Singapore. But watch this space, because all the cool things in AI and medical advancements, I think, are going to come out of Asia, but more generally, China.
So what does that mean for the rest of the world? We'll just collaborate, and then...
It's not a matter of giving up. It just says, unless anywhere, it doesn't matter. I mean, you can go to Silicon Valley. If you go to Silicon Valley, most of the investors there are not putting in anywhere near the same resource at basic level. Some of the things that made Silicon Valley, and Mary and I are 100% on the same page, some of the things that made Silicon Valley was the U.S. government closing one eye and allowing AT&T to maintain a monopolistic position because they were driving Bell Labs.
That's right.
And Bell Labs was producing all kinds of cool things for the military, which also had a lot of cool opportunities outside. And the deal was, as long as you do that for us and you make it available to others, that's why semiconductors were available, because Bell had to make them available. So these things are happening, but they're not happening today.
No, they aren't.
So it's a matter now of partnering, collaborating, aligning, learning, whatever the right words are. And that's 100% our strategy is, what can we do and how do we fit into this bigger picture? So it doesn't matter for us that we're 5.5 million people. The answer is, if we can be great in a niche and we can add value to this larger scenario that's occurring, so you can be sure that we're spending time on AV and AI, and we're doing a lot of that with our friends to the north. Absolutely.
It does speak to one issue, and I am a sociologist, and that is cultural and social diversity. And Europe still feels very homogeneous to me. My university, which only takes the top 10% of students, it's a public university, 51% of our freshman class is Asian. Those are the best students. And Annalise Aksanian and others have written about this, that the relationships, the legacy relationships with this cultural and social diversity in India, in China, in Europe too, in Sweden for the Silicon Valley for sure, have the promise of benefiting us in this new world you're talking about. And I also think it's very interesting that now, my son was a product of private schools, and I was very impressed about 20 years ago when his school started offering Mandarin. Now all the public schools in Southern California, you have the option of learning Mandarin. So these are indicators of a sense that we have to change, and we have to be ready for those markets. So for those of us who live in very homogeneous societies, I think we have to ask, not how do we have to necessarily diversify, but how do we overcome the limitations of one language, one religion, one culture, when the world is now so extraordinarily diverse. And I think it can be through education.
Anyone wants to add to?
Sorry, but this education thing, which I know Sweden has a rich heritage of prioritizing education, but I think the point, Mike Milken had put out some work as part of some of his Milken Institute, showing that generally, if you take a look at the percentage of income that parents spent on certain items,
yes,
education was far and away the biggest item for most Asian parents, to be quote-unquote stereotypical. And it was something like number 5 or 6 for North America, behind housing and automobiles and other things. And so the reality is that if you take a look at most of the people with whom I work, I'm by far the least well-educated. I'm just a sort of grungy street fighter sort of that tries to build companies. And I articulate it that way. The answer is, I don't know that much about this. All I know is if I build something that costs $1, I better sell it for more than $1 if I want to be in business tomorrow. So I try and work with that. But almost everybody with whom I work will have multiple degrees. Many of the people with whom I work are Rhodes Scholars or MacArthur Fellows and all these scenarios. And the answer is because education has been prioritized as a path out of irrelevance. And so Singapore has put a massive prioritization on that, to the point that everybody in a room will have at least a master's, if not a PhD and or an MD and or MBA. A couple of people I work with are PhDs and medical doctors because they decided they hadn't learned enough. So the challenge then is, how does that compare to the rest of the world? Because that is the reality of what's happening. And so when people are angsting about whether they're innovative enough and creative enough, the raw materials that are being formed and coalesced in some of these other markets, Vietnam is now one of the hottest software development sites on the planet. So I think that there's a collective that a lot of people may not fully appreciate because of this idea that there tends to be a local perspective, and it doesn't matter which local, but a local perspective.
Yeah. Camilla, you.
Yeah, I mean, Vietnam was the poorest country in the world after the war, and is now a middle-income country and has made a tremendous journey. As far as education goes, I mean, my colleagues at the embassy, my Vietnamese colleagues, their children would every day after school go to extra classes in English, in mathematics, in French, and so forth. My own kids would come home from school and whoa, you know, Facebook and it's true. The Asian parents spent a lot of money, and it wasn't cheap, even though Vietnam has quite a low level of cost. But it wasn't cheap to put the kids into these extra classes. One thing, though, that Vietnam still doesn't have is the innovative capacity. And of course, in a one-party system where the state controls everything, including what you can post and you cannot post on Facebook and how you can interact, this hampers development. And as an ambassador, I always try to take the edge that, yes, if you want to have economic growth, you have to have an open and free climate to enhance the willingness and enable innovation in innovative capacity. And this was something the government understood because, yes, they wanted to have economic growth, and they do have an economic growth. We're very envious looking at their figures, 6.5% for the last 10 years, and that goes for all of Asia. But this is where we still have an edge compared to some of the countries in Asia, not Singapore, of course. But the openness, the transparency, the encouragement from the government to foster cooperation between different countries and universities, this is still lacking a bit, to be honest.
There was one question that was raised earlier today that talked about, I think it was Steve that talked about sort of, I mean, the difficulty we have to solve the big problems. I mean, as they do as SG Innovate, I mean, if you come with an app idea, it's like, well, there's somewhere else you should go. But they really, now the Singaporean government is putting serious resources in sort of solving or helping to be a part of solving the global problems. So how can we be better at doing that in whatever region, because that's we really need to collaborate on. It's not like one single place that can choose whatever big problem on the template. So what are your thoughts about that?
I guess one important instrument in order to promote tackling the global challenges is already in place. This is the European Framework Program for Research and Technology and Demonstration, which is now on the, I guess, with Horizon 2020, we have the 8th framework program already in place. So I think the Europeans are already used to cooperate for the big challenges on a European level, and that's good. And I very much appreciate it. I was involved in projects in the 5th, and the 6th, and the 7th framework program, so we made a lot of experience, and I very much appreciate that, the cooperation among across the borders. But what is still missing, to my understanding or to my feeling, is to go beyond the European framework program. There are some instruments in place in order to foster the so-called international cooperation. International means beyond the EU borders, and to foster that. But to make use of all the potentials, for example, with the Asian countries and of course with North America and others, Africa, for example, as well, it is very important to open up the framework programs we have in Europe, or make more use of them also for the international cooperation. That's kind of a clear for the next framework program, which probably will start somewhere in 2020.
Do you see that happening, given what was just said about how the growth is in Southeast Asia and everything there, and then we kind of being protectionistic within the EU with this framework program is part of sort of almost a fortress Europe when it comes to that? Why don't we, because we have to move fast. I mean, it's 7, 8, 9 year programs and but how do we sort of accelerate that?
For the moment, the main purpose of the RTD programs in Europe is to protect and to further develop the competitiveness of the European players. So that's clear. This was the basic idea. But it needs to be changed, slightly changed or dramatically changed, whatever you mean, to a mean of cooperation with other parts of the world. So I think there's no way out. You mentioned the period, 7 periods is now the period of the framework programs. It was 5 years before. Now we are in the middle of the Horizon 2020. There was a kind of middle milestone assessment, having some implications for the second period, for the second 3-year period. But you're right. This process is sometimes too slow in order to cope with the challenges we have on a global perspective.
Yeah, Maria.
I think we probably need also to actually look at the incentives for solving those kind of problems compared to doing other stuff. And one thing that is happening to a certain extent in California and also elsewhere, and it has happened historically and also now, is the use of innovation prizes. And I think the X Prize Foundation is an inspiration in that regard. And my organization, the Stockholm Chamber, is home to one of the world's largest arbitration institutes, and we have recently launched an initiative called the Stockholm Treaty Lab, which has been inspired by X Prize Foundation, and we're using their commercial platform as well for this prize. And what we are doing, because we are into international arbitration, is that we are looking at how could we work with investment protection and the treaties and the law to create incentives for more investments into sustainable solutions. And that is just a tiny example, but I think we could probably do a lot more on the incentive side in order to channel more resources into those important issues that you are raising.
So our recent election has created a problem for what I'm about to say to you, but I think it's very interesting the extent to which the United States has paid attention to what's going on in the EU and also in Asia, because there were a number of initiatives during the Obama administration where scientists literally sat in the Oval Office with the president, talking about the big challenges, renewable energy, understanding the brain, world hunger, that these would be appropriate targets for R&D development and major new initiatives through the agencies so that universities across America could compete or collaborate. And that is under threat right now. And California is a wealthy state and has many, many foundations, but there's no way it can match what the federal government can do. And I'm pretty sure that's true across Europe as well. You can have very wealthy countries, but to have the combined resources matching regional or local funds. And so it's a very hard time in the United States right now, because I do think scientists and civic leaders recognize that we need to address these big issues, but there's no clear path given our current political environment.
It was interesting to listen to Macron after
Yes.
Trump declared that the United States will no longer be part of the Paris Agreement, welcoming all the researchers to France. And I think it's the attraction of talent that will actually decide whether we will have the interesting innovation in the future.
It's a very big issue.
Yeah, and coming to sustainable energy, I mean, China today is the biggest producer of solar panels. So it's an interesting development, and I'm very afraid that the United States will actually lag behind because of the present policies.
Yeah.
Stockholm has declared that it will be fossil fuel free capital by 2040, and the pace that things are developing, I think it could very much be the case. I mean, we have all our buses running on biogas. We don't have enough garbage even for heating up our houses. We import from Norway and from the UK, and I think it's in our DNA to think in a sustainable way.
Right.
Because as children, we were taught to keep Sweden clean, and not in a nationalistic way. Just you pick up whatever you have. You don't throw anything, not even... Sorry? You start with the batteries. You collect the batteries.
My mother collected the string around the newspapers.
So for us, even to throw a chewing gum or something, it's totally impossible for us, and I think that it will be the sustainable cities, as I was saying before, that will attract the researchers because of the quality of life.
So I'll make 2 quick points. One is, I'm always trying to ask the question in Singapore: are we adopting something or are we creating something? So I'm not so concerned about whether we adopt a technology that somebody else has created in order to try and improve a problem. I think that's useful, and we should always do that. The question is, what can we innovate, create that others would like to adopt? So part of our challenge is not about adopting things as much as being better at creating things. Number 2 is kind of back to the point that we were discussing a moment ago. Generally, if you follow the philosophy that necessity is what drives answers, the US doesn't have needs. And I would argue that Sweden doesn't have needs. Right? I mean, these are high-class problems. Singapore does not have needs. One of our biggest challenges is there was big problems. There was no water. There was no sanitation. There was no safe housing. So those are pretty important problems to solve, and they were. Now the question is, can we refine the bus arrival time to be slightly more quick? Can the buses be slightly less crowded? So those are refinements. So the reason that I'm back to, it's going to be Myanmar, it's going to be Cambodia, and Laos, and Vietnam, and China that are driving Africa. That's why China is the biggest investor in Africa. So it's creating both an innovation engine and a consumption engine. So I think our collective challenge is, it's great for scientists and amazing people to sit and think about cool things to work on. But if you then go home and you're in your nice home and you've driven your nice car and you're in front of the nice fire, it's pretty difficult to think about solving something. But when you are cold and hungry and starving, then you are going to work hard. And that's why generally all great startup ecosystems tend to be heavy on immigrant. Silicon Valley being a famous example.
The most famous,
we're always worrying about that. Many of the founders with whom we work at SG Innovate are in Singapore, but they're non-Singaporean. And so many of the entrepreneurs are PhDs that came to Singapore from India, Bangladesh, wherever. And the answer is now they've got a PhD in photonics and they're trying to think of something cool to build. And I'm having a hard time making sure that there's enough citizens that want to be founders in order to make sure that I have some equilibrium, because in some of the cohorts, I can have 80, 85% non-citizen, but they're the ones that are pushing and pushing and pushing because it's a burn the boats philosophy. So that's why for us, if somebody isn't all in, meaning if there's a comfortable and safe place to go home to, and they're sort of trying to do this startup thing on nights and weekends, we don't work with them. Because the answer is there's not enough
It's called a lifestyle
hunger.
entrepreneur.
Yeah, you have to burn the boat and say there's only one way forward, and it's over there. And that's why I'm generally against grants and things that are free. I think I'm a big fan of grants for research. I'm anti-grants for startups and entrepreneurs as a general philosophy.
Well, with that, we need to take a short, just a stop, because I know I promised Stephen to be on the car to the airport, so he can leave the country in time.
My apologies, but I do need to catch a flight back to London. There's a massive event tomorrow afternoon in London with entrepreneurs, and then I'm taking my wife for my 30th wedding anniversary on
wonderful.
Friday morning, and that is non-negotiable.
That's
right?
non-negotiable. Yeah.
So now we're going to also have we have some time now, and I want all of you to pick up your phone again and swipe down on that app and work together as you did before the lunch in 3/4 and come up with some questions and comments that we can sort of ask to the panel here, and you can do it in Swedish if you want, and we'll translate them. And so take 3 to 4 minutes. Think about what you want to have asked now, or comments, or to use the knowledge of the panel, and we'll let them catch their breath for a few minutes, and then we'll get back to you. So please. And it's going to be question number 9, because that's the 9th question of the day when you swipe down. We start with that. So, okay, how do we create enough hunger in Sweden as a driving force for innovation? Okay. Woo!
That is a really good question, and I wanted to comment on what Stephen said before he left, because I think that is probably the greatest challenge that countries like Sweden and successful places like Stockholm are facing. How not to become a fat cat or just fat and happy. And that is also what I tend to answer when they ask what's the biggest challenge, and everyone expects me to say like shortage of housing. No, it's this. So I've been inspired by Professor Kotter at Harvard, and he's writing about change management and change leadership. And what he says is that you need to create a sense of urgency in any organization, and I would argue it goes for a city, region, or a country too. You need to create a sense of urgency. That is the first step if you want change to happen, no matter what. And the question is, how do you do that when you're on when you are peaking, when you are being successful? And I think that, it goes for every leader, no matter if you're the governor or you're a dean or you're heading a unit at the foreign ministry or you're in a startup, or a CEO of the chamber. And that is actually one thing that I've worked with my organization on, how do we create this sense of urgency? Even right now, my organization, we're growing, we're getting new members, we're considered successful. And what keeps me awake at night is not becoming fat and happy. And one thing we did was that we did pre-mortem. So we actually asked ourselves, okay, 5 years from now, or 3 years from now, or 10 years from now, we're not successful anymore. And then we did a backcasting. Where did we go wrong? And through that exercise, we identified, yeah, exactly, and created an action plan. It's basic, but it works.
So this may sound like an odd response, but I've interviewed the founders of some of these very large companies like Hybridtech and Qualcomm, and yes, they were immigrants or children of immigrants, but they didn't want to get rich. They wanted to solve a problem. So that Erwin and Andy really felt they had a better wireless technology platform with CDMA than you did with TDMA. And they went after it with a vengeance, you know. Ivor Royston, who started Hybritech, which was acquired by Lilly, his mother died of cancer when he was 13. And he said, when I grow up, I'm going to be a doctor, and I'm going to find a cure for cancer. And over again, I'm struck. So I think you can be fat and happy and passion-driven. So I think about the young people today in California around renewable energy, around food safety and security and locally sourced food, issues of huge social inequities within cities, but also among countries. And so I think where we'll see the innovation and entrepreneurship won't just be in the next best cell phone or the next best drug, but it might be in energy, or it might be in technologies that can deliver education or health care to remote sites at low cost. I don't know if I'm making sense. And so I find myself as a professor and a mentor wanting to encourage kids to follow their passion. And I'm kind of envious, if I may be candid, of Europe right now, because in the United States, the costs of higher education, you can't imagine the debt young people are coming out of school, even middle-class people, particularly families that have 2 or 3 children, you know, all going to university at the same time. The issues around health care, the issues around who's going to take care of my sick mother. You know, my son doesn't have that problem with me. I have a very good health care system in the university, but it is something a son worries about or a daughter worries about. The absence of transportation infrastructure. So the costs of cars and fuel. So the risk, it's harder to take chances. It's harder to pursue your passions when you carry that load as a 25 or 26-year-old. I don't think in Sweden or Germany or France, young people carry those loads. And it can either make them fat and happy, or they can say, my God, I'm liberated to save the world. You know, and so I think a lot of it is this sort of cultural education process that we have to mentor and support. The hunger is around, boy, I sound Swedish now. But there are these huge social justice issues that at least I see young people very, very concerned about.
I think we have some more questions to put up. So the question is, what should Stockholm focus on? Who wants to focus on when it comes to developing innovation, I would assume, to become more innovative?
Yeah, but I think it was very, well put by Mary earlier. You know, you shouldn't pick winners. You know, we shouldn't try to create any sort of cluster, but given that there is an emerging cluster, we could create the right business environment, the right incentives, so on and so forth. From a sort of regional perspective, there are some, we are very both lucky and successful in many ways, but there is a housing shortage. There are some incentive problems. If you look, there are some specific tax issues. For example, we could improve air connectivity, so on and so forth. So there are general things that Stockholm, the region, should focus on, but we shouldn't try to pick winners.
Another question? Going to pick a few. I'll read it for you. Give me that. It is obvious that we need to be better in harnessing the existing pool of talent, which is full of hungry people. Our challenge is really to value diversity. Homogeneity is our biggest challenge. Secondly, we need to be better, I assume, in defining our unique USPs, clean water, welfare, etc. Agree? Disagree?
Agree. And yeah, it's a very good comment. And in the export strategy, one of the important parts of this is how we can attract talents to Stockholm. So this is something that the government really understands, not only to Stockholm, actually, to all of Sweden, to all of our universities, because as we always think, competition is good. Competition is good when it comes to free trade. Competition is good when it comes to universities. And competition is good when it comes to trying to attract the best students and also to attract the best talents for our companies.
Yes. Do we have some more questions? How could Stockholm region and Sweden, together with other parties within the European Union, enhance valuable collaboration with China?
We do have, of course, through our embassy and through our government agencies based in Beijing, a lot of collaboration already. But I think that this is something that we will look into expanding further, and soon we will have a high-level delegation going to Beijing, headed by our Prime Minister, and during his time there, a lot of these issues will actually be addressed.
There are two emerging global industries which need much more innovation, but also would be interesting from a European perspective, not the least Swedish, and that is trade in healthcare and the needs in Asia and other emerging parts of the world for more healthcare, no matter if it's sort of construction of clinics and hospitals, education of nurses, or actually operating clinics. And of course, health tech and pharmaceuticals and so on and so forth. And the other new, I would argue, new global industry is education. And look at the US, Mary mentioned it, you know, there has to be an education innovation that solves this terrible cost explosion in the US higher ed system. And, you know, the entrepreneur or the companies that come up with those solutions would probably both be wealthy, and they will sleep well at night because they will have a sense of purpose, what you earlier talked about. So Sweden should probably think about how we could position Swedish education and healthcare when we look at China and some other emerging markets.
Well, thank you. We'll take one final question here. Brexit. How would that affect? I would assume how would.
Yes. Well, let's see the glass as half full rather than half empty. Stockholm is competing for the European Medical Agency, which is right now located in the UK, and we have a very good infrastructure for this specific sector within life science and medical research. So we think we are a very good competitor, but a lot of European countries are, of course, competing, and
particularly in this area.
and particularly in this area. No, for us it will be very difficult once the UK exits from the internal market, because the UK is one of our largest trading partners, and Swedish companies employ more than 200,000 Brits and Brits.
Wow.
Yes. So it will be very difficult, and therefore our Minister of Trade would like to have as soft a Brexit as possible. And now with the elections in the UK, Theresa May might not have the same mandate as she had before. So again, looking at the glass as half full, maybe then there would be a better opportunity for us to strike a good deal with the UK.
Right. Do you want to add something about Brexit?
Yes, just a remark on that. So, of course, I fully agree to your position that we should have a very smooth Brexit compared to a very hard one. So, this is the position in Germany as well. In particular, in Berlin, we are looking for some profits from the Brexit. So we are looking to London, of course. Are there companies that are looking for a new place inside Europe? This is I would say this is normal business of a regional agency to look for opportunities. But in total, the Brexit is even for Berlin is even not wish to say so. So we try to make the best of it, but it would be a better situation if the UK would stay inside the European Union. But this is now they decided so far. And on the medical agency you mentioned, in fact we are kind of competitors for that. Even if the German side decided not to further on go for the EMA application due to a kind of a deal maybe that the agency for the banks is probably going to Frankfurt, and then there's no way for another agency going to Germany. So. Yeah, maybe, okay. I take this home to our politicians. Yeah.
Maybe we struck a deal here, so the competition things.
Yeah, okay.
And
yeah, right.
with that, thank you very much. It's time to end this panel. Thank you very much for your insights and comments. And let's give them a hand.